I've got to put some stuff away. This I circled this on my list though. I'm super interested in different grazing practices.
There's no right answer, so definitely like constant communication. It feels like you have to be communicating more than you can.
Huh. Yeah, I see a bunch of paper towels going around. Oh, I did not. You think they'd be hard to hide? Yeah, I wonder if somebody threw them out for me.
The staff came in and took out this other table, but
Oh,
there
it
wasn't
must be
anything
there
on it.
I'm gonna come. I need to clean this table.
I guess we'll have one of these start on 5 minutes. So we'll give it a few.
I'm not done. That
How are
way,
you, Chip?
well,
I'm retired.
yeah, I like the present perfect pencil.
Yeah, I can get it up easier.
Is this like a creative speaking prop? Nobody knows?
Somebody actually took off because did you take
She'll show up, yeah.
So thanks you guys for coming. To Grazing from the Wildfire, we have Liza here presenting, and you can all have your evaluation health questions at the end. And it sounds like if you have questions, just kind of go ahead and ask them as they come up.
Okay. If I stand here, is the microphone picking up? Sounds like it is. I'm guessing that not a lot of you are managing large acreages of shrub steppe in eastern Washington. Are any of you from the east side of Washington? Okay. Yeah, so this may be more of a, I think there are some, even though most of you are not dealing with trying to limit wildfire on your own landscape, there's some significant ecological topics that we'll talk about that I think will be useful regardless of what you're doing. For those who I don't know, I'm a range and livestock specialist with Washington State University Extension out of Ellensburg, and have been with WSU for, I guess, 18 years now. Fire is a tricky topic. People tend to have strong opinions about grazing shrub steppe in eastern Washington, and there are some controversial ideas about about what to do with fire. There are some significant benefits to fire. For most of the Intermountain West, and I would say even broader than that, nearly any part of the country that has mostly a wintertime precipitation pattern with dry summers, where you can have the accumulation of vegetation that then dries out in the summer and is prone to burn. Fire is something we have to think about, and there's some significant benefits to fire. It reduces standing dead plant material, which is prone to accumulate in places where we don't have a heavy snow load and don't have anything harvesting plant material. It tends to release native forbs that can oftentimes get choked out by a heavy standing grass. There's some nutrient cycling that happens after fire that is useful in provoking germination of some species, and also in getting shrub recruitment. Interestingly, the historic fire frequency on eastern Washington rangelands would be anywhere from 35 to 250 years, and if you asked 10 fire ecologists about this, you'd get 17 different opinions. But man has had a love-hate relationship with fire for as long as people have been managing landscapes. There was a book written, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago by Charles Mann titled 1491. And it was actually written in response to a book that he wrote called 1493, which was a history of the Americas after Columbus. And he ran across enough archaeological and anthropological research that had been done, say, in the last 50 years, that he felt like it was important to write something about the history of the people in the Americas, North America, Central America, and South America, before Columbus arrived. And one of the conclusions was that probably most of North America had a significantly larger population than we've historically given credit for, and that the people that were here were significantly influencing the landscape for much farther back and in a much larger spatial scale than we would have given them credit for a long time back. So the indigenous peoples all over North America burned both for manipulating game populations, sometimes as part of warfare tactics, and then later, a lot of the non-Anglo peoples who were sheep herders across the West also used fire as a tool to manage forage. So fire has a pretty long history, and so it's difficult to separate what was anthropogenic fire from what would have been wildfire. But in general, most of the West produces stuff that dries out and is prone to burn, and it burns periodically. But following the introduction of invasive annual grasses of various kinds, a number of fire ecologists have concluded that fire probably is the biggest threat to shrub steppe habitats in most of the West, particularly in the Northwest. And this is relevant to things like endangered sage grouse and other things that depend on sagebrush in particular. Because one of the dominant effects of fire, if it's a continuous fire, is that it removes woody species, and oftentimes they take a long time to come back. And if the fire return interval is shorter than what it takes to start to regrow a shrub, then you end up with a landscape that doesn't have any shrubs. The opposite can occur as well. Nathan Sayre, who's a geographer at UC Berkeley, wrote a book called Politics of Scale, A History of Rangeland Science, 2017. And he chronicles in there some of the history of our relationship with fire and fire research and range research. And in the desert Southwest, we were successful enough in excluding fire to the point that much of it converted essentially permanently to solid shrubland, where there's almost no grass and in some cases not many forbs left. And that appears to be in some places largely irreversible, even in spite of some efforts to revegetate, with pretty aggressive rehabilitation methods. Matt Germino is a range scientist with the USGS out of Idaho, and they have some pretty well-structured research projects associated with the Soda Fire, which was a big fire in the Owyhees in southern Idaho, maybe 2015. I did an interview with him on my podcast, the Art of Range podcast, and he says, fire is, in my mind, a trigger that allows the effects of all these other landscape stressors to become expressed. And fire is unambiguously one of the biggest threats to greater sage-grouse populations in the West. So while we have, as a culture, I think, reacted appropriately to the Smokey the Bear campaigns that were extremely successful in preventing wildfire in forests, with some of the problems associated with that, we need to recognize that in shrub steppe, we may not need more fire right now. So we have the challenge of dealing with these invasive annual grasses that have probably changed how we have to manage most western rangelands permanently. There's a couple significant things that dramatically change how fire interacts with whatever plant population is there. The most obvious one is that these invasive annual grasses have much lower moisture levels in the plant tissue itself, and it remains dry for a much larger portion of the year. So in places where stuff like cheatgrass has taken over, we can have a condition that looks like this from the 15th of May until the 15th of October, where in a landscape that's still dominated by perennial grasses that maybe looks more like this. This is actually a photograph on August 1. I mean, you can see just from the color of the plants that there's significantly more fuel moisture, plant moisture remaining in the 1st of August. The other big thing that is a dramatic change, more of a structural change with invasive annual grasses, is that we have greater fuel continuity, where the native bunchgrass range across nearly all of the Intermountain West and through the Great Basin includes bunchgrass plants that have natural interspaces between the plants that aren't growing things and don't have flammable plant material. And once cheatgrass or medusa head or ventonata takes over, then you have this solid carpet of vegetation that is dry for most of the potential fire season. And unfortunately, that situation also starts off this snowball effect where you have an increased fire cycle, you have higher mortality on the preferred desirable plants, and then you get more of the stuff you don't want. Let's see, so what should be our goals? What are the things we're aiming for in thinking through the different ways that we can manipulate plant communities preemptively, in preparation for the likelihood of fire, knowing that we're in a fire-prone landscape? Even much of the west side of Washington, we're not fire-proof. There's just more vegetation to potentially burn when it does dry out. the most obvious thing is that we still have to encourage the perennial species and most notably have to promote seed production. Most of the perennial grasses that are native to the Intermountain West do not reproduce vegetatively. They reproduce sexually or by seed production. So if we prevent them from producing seed every single year, you eventually select away from the most desirable and most stabilizing plants in the community. But we also have to give some thought as to how to discourage the invasive annual grasses. And of course, they are also relying on seed production for reproduction. And these goals can be somewhat antagonistic if we're trying to stop seed production on one and promote seed production on the other. If we have say a 90-day window when soil temperature and soil moisture supports plant growth. Where there are weeds, we have to give some thought to that as well because they can effectively choke out, especially new plants. So we're trying to promote perennial seed production on top of plant vigor, and we'll come back to that in a minute. But if in a landscape that has burned, maybe has burned multiple times, what should our goals be to try to rehabilitate that landscape? It's still encouraging perennial species. It's still trying to discourage the invasive annual grasses. We still want to think through how we can maybe discourage weeds and promote perennial seed production. But there's a few new ideas in the academic landscape anyway that are being tried out. Dr. Barry Perryman is a range ecologist at University of Nevada, Reno, and he through some military contracts has done a fair bit of research in the Middle East in some of the places where cheatgrass is native, and he points out in a paper a few years ago that's challenging our paradigm for how to control invasive annual grasses that Bromus tectorum, which is the name for cheatgrass, literally means brome of the roof. Tecton is Latin for roof. And he says in much of the Mediterranean and the Middle East where cheatgrass is native, you find it most commonly on the top of thatched roofs, because this species has a seed that will put out a radical, a root hair that goes down as much as 7 or 8 inches through a litter layer, and if it finds some moisture at the bottom of that litter layer, it just needs, a week or two worth of moisture in order for it to have enough life to produce a seed head and continue the life cycle. And so it was titled a brome of the roof because it's one of the only things that could survive in this microenvironment that doesn't have any soil, where it can survive literally on top of a thatch layer where there's no dirt. So it's his contention that probably understanding some of the ecology around this litter layer is maybe the key to helping control many of the invasive annual grasses, because Medusa head is similar in terms of its ability to thrive on top of a thatch layer where nothing else grows. And many of you may be aware that most perennial grass species require their seed to come in contact with bare mineral soil to germinate. And so where you have this persistent thatch layer, and if you know what Medusa head looks like, it's got this real distinct chevron pattern on the seed head that forms a pretty fluffy and stable matrix of thatch that is really durable and prevents perennial grass seed from getting through it. And so this is part of the snowball effect, where once we have invasive annual grasses that take over, they create a durable thatch layer. That thatch layer prevents perennial grasses, which are dependent on seed production, from getting seed to soil so that they can germinate. And pretty soon we have mostly invasive annual grass. So he has run, along with some folks in Idaho and Utah, some pretty large research trials using fall and wintertime grazing to try to reduce some of this standing litter, since that's one of the key factors in promoting the invasive annual grass cycle. And they've been pretty successful. One of the reasons for that is that cheatgrass and the other invasive annual grasses are usually a biennial that begins their growth cycle in the fall of the year. So they'll germinate in the fall and then overwinter as a seedling, and then they are prepared to get out in front of everything else that's growing in the springtime. In fact, that's how cheatgrass got its name. was by showing up in wheat fields. The cheatgrass would establish and get 3 to 4 inches tall in the winter, and in the springtime it would come up ahead of the wheat and choke out the wheat and cheat a farmer out of a wheat crop. So Dr. Barry Perryman would say probably our first concern, if we ever hope to get ahead of cheatgrass, which can be a really, really significant problem, one that's nearly insurmountable, is to deal with this thatch layer. And then secondarily, we still have to think about how do we encourage the perennial species to grow, because long term, that's the only way a site will be stabilized, is by having the perennials that come back. And we still need seed production. So the cheatgrass, I got ahead of myself. The cheatgrass also has the effect of increasing the likelihood of perennial plants being killed by fire, because this standing dead material on top of the ground dramatically increases the fire temperature as it comes across, and it results in greater heat transfer to the crown of the plant, and we get more perennial grasses that get killed. So this is another effect that affects fire behavior and that is relevant to our thinking here. So we're going to come back around to talking about grazing, but I want to point out that once we get into this situation where there are invasive annual grasses everywhere, and they have begun to exclude the desirable perennial plants and oftentimes even shrubs by virtue of this fire frequency that is fast enough that the shrubs can't get going, there's only so many ways to deal with that. And we've got some mechanical treatments that can be used to try to control unwanted plants. Some of them are sort of effective, but they're only effective in places where you can get large equipment around. They tend to also include very high soil disturbance, which isn't so much a big deal if you don't have any invasive plants in the community, because most of what would get disturbed is desirable seed. That's not the case if there's any undesirables around. And of course, it's extravagantly expensive. And we're talking about rangelands here that, are not producing a lot of economic value per acre. And so our inputs have to have, some level of correlation with what the possible revenue is from these acreages. And of course, there's some chemical treatments. Actually, with invasive annual grasses, these tend to be more effective than mechanical treatments. There are some pretty effective herbicides that are germination inhibitors that do a good job of slowing down cheatgrass. But again, that can't be done on an annual basis at any reasonable cost, and they tend to be. It requires repeat application in order for it to be effective. So we've got some biological treatments, which could include both burning and grazing. Burning has been used. Of course, the difficulty with burning in the West is that if you're a private landowner, this is pretty risky. If the fire gets off of your property, you become liable for the suppression costs of a wildfire, which everybody knows can run into the hundreds of millions of dollars. Because we have relatively low control over fire, even in a situation where, you've got a crew that is doing some pretty intensive work to try to control fire. Prescribed burning, though, can be a pretty good tool during certain times of the year when there's lower risk of it getting away from you, and when it's combined with a herbicide treatment. So, for example, with a germination inhibitor, herbicides like Plateau only work if they get down to the seed. And so where you've got, say, some shrub cover or a heavy thatch layer, you may have significant spray shadow where the herbicide's not getting to the seed that it's supposed to be controlling. And we still have some pretty unpredictable results. Grazing, though, is one of the things that we have some control over that can be effective in reducing the reproductive success of invasive annual grass, and that can assist with promoting the perennial plants that we want to keep. It's much lower in cost and typically doesn't have much soil disturbance and certainly doesn't have the concerns with smoke like you do with fire. And there's some pretty interesting history with research on grazing and fire. I ran across a Forest Service fire conference proceedings document from about 1914, and if it didn't have a date on it, it could have been written yesterday. They're asking all the same questions, named all the same unknowns that require further research. But also the interesting thing was that it was politically volatile, even back like in the 1930s. This is not rocket science. People discovered in the 1930s that fire could improve forage conditions, that it could reduce shrub cover, that it improved forage quality because you're removing a lot of the standing dead that animals usually have to eat. And the reason why this fellow S.W. Green got fired was because the Forest Service was at that point pretty committed to a fire suppression policy to protect merchantable timber. And also at that point, they really hadn't distinguished that much between fire ecology on rangelands versus forests. And then a guy in Arizona in 1904 pointed out that the restocking of the perennial range by new plants took place sporadically. This is notable for a couple of reasons. One is that in 1904, this was really dryland ecology science. These were just observations that they were making. But it was also back at a time when the dominant ideas about vegetation succession, how plant communities change over time, were based on observations in the Midwest, where you had a lot more precipitation. You had plant communities that behaved much differently. And if any of you have heard of the idea of a climax plant community, this is the idea that if you don't attempt to manipulate a plant community, it will inevitably move towards some complex, biologically diverse plant community that represents climax. So if we, a classic example is old field succession. If we, wheat farmed a piece of ground in the 1950s and then just walked away from it because it wasn't profitable to farm wheat, what would happen on that piece of bare dirt? You would get early colonizer species that would move in. They would eventually get replaced by some more desirable perennial plants, and over time you would gradually have an increase in the diversity of the botanical composition of that piece of ground until you got to some endpoint. And that endpoint, according to some of these folks in Nebraska, would be called the climax plant community, and that all these different multiple pathways would converge on the same climax plant community for a given piece of ground, meaning that on this spot of dirt, there was a single climax plant community that represented the endpoint of succession. So this guy in Arizona was recognizing that it's actually much more chaotic or stochastic than that, that there could be multiple pathways and multiple stable plant communities and multiple endpoints, depending on what kind of things happen to the plant community in the meantime. Today that is considered the way that Western plant communities work. We call it the state and transition model, meaning we have this state which represents some relatively stable assemblage of species, and they're going to change in response to different stressors, and we can through various kinds of environmental disturbances, which could include fire, insect infestation, overgrazing, wind erosion, water erosion, you could end up with a different but stable and potentially less desirable plant community. So we transition from a stable state, through a transition phase into a different stable state. And this guy in Arizona identified that a long time ago. That's going to become relevant here in just a minute. But in 2014, a century later, you've still got all these fire research papers saying limited data exists to quantify plant response to grazing after fire or plant response during fire. So a couple things on grazing. Mike Borman was the range professor at Oregon State University for many years, and he wrote a paper in 2005 trying to distinguish between the severe, heavy grazing that occurred during the cattle boom of the 1880s and 90s and what's being practiced today. And because we have some legacy effects from overgrazing that largely was the result of easy credit and not so much people that didn't know what they were doing, although there was some of that as well. And that caused some permanent changes to the landscape, which were nearly all negative, that we're still dealing with. But you know, what most people are doing today as far as in grazing management is not that kind of grazing at all. And in fact, Kurt Davies, who's the head of the Oregon Burns Research Station, said in 2010 that moderate levels of cattle grazing by reducing the risk of wildfire, not eliminating the risk of wildfire, and exotic plant invasions may help protect sagebrush. So we want to distinguish these two different kinds of grazing management, and I hope that'll be useful to some of you. I like to say that this is how the West was lost. There were some pretty unuseful rules of thumb that were applied by the people that moved into the West that weren't illogical. They just didn't apply in the new plant community. You know, most of the people that began grazing in the West came from the East. And the people that were in the East mostly came from Europe. And they were used to dealing with sod-forming or rhizomatous plant communities that responded pretty favorably to frequent defoliation by grazing animals. It's just like in your lawn. If you have sod-forming grasses in your lawn, they form a turf. When you mow them and remove some of the material, it stimulates the plant to send out new shoots and fill in bare ground and have more stems, you know, per area than you would have otherwise. And so one of the adages was that a grass plant's goal in life is to produce a seed head, and the cowman's goal is to prevent it from doing that. Well, that works really well if you're grazing sod-forming plant species like Kentucky bluegrass and orchard grass and turf-type fescues and some of the stuff that was native to most of the East and all across the South. But it didn't work once it encountered blue bunch wheatgrass and Idaho fescue and most of the jointed bunch grasses that we find in the West. So when we apply these bad rules of thumb, where we're grazing frequently during the active growth period, when those plants are trying to produce a seed head, we end up with very little litter production that helps protect the soil surface and provide some temperature amelioration on bare ground. We end up with animals coming back and regrazing plants that they grazed once before because the regrowth is significantly higher in forage value than the stuff that is adjacent to it that didn't get used. This puts the most preferred plants at a significant disadvantage to other species that may be either tolerant of that grazing pressure or they're resistant to grazing by various anti-quality features of the plant. This would be sort of like if you go into your garden and clip off the tomatoes at about 6 inches and leave all the lamb's quarters and pigweed. You know, you repeat that a few times and pretty soon you have a garden that doesn't have any tomatoes and it's full of weeds. If we apply essentially that same scenario got applied to a lot of rangelands. So continuing this downward spiral, if we do that for long enough, the perennial plants don't produce seed. Those plants have a lifespan. They eventually die. They don't live forever. And so we end up with a lack of new plants. The old plants senesce and die. The plants that are not being grazed, either because they're tolerant of grazing or they're resistant to grazing, expand. We get exotic species moving in. And then pretty soon we've gone through this transition. We've gone over this ecological threshold into a new but degraded stable state characterized by things like, you know, you name it. But, you know, the one that occupies millions of acres of the West is sagebrush, cheatgrass, you know, invasive forbs like knapweed, and some of the native short grasses like Poa secunda, sandberg bluegrass that are tolerant of that kind of grazing. So now we have a new situation, but removing the disturbance that caused that situation doesn't make it go back. This was the idea that they had in Nebraska with the climax plant community. The idea was that all of these disturbances function like pressure on a spring, and that once you, such as grazing pressure, And if you remove the pressure on that spring, it's going to automatically move back to whatever that climax plant community was. It took a while, but we discovered that that was not the case, and that didn't happen. So once we have crossed over into this new degraded stable state, we can't just remove the sort of grazing pressure that caused it in the first place and expect it to go back. So what are some things that we can do to recover? And what do we mean by fire control? This is why I like the language of reducing fire risk or limiting fire risk. You know, you could say that if we graze hard enough, you can remove enough fuel that you can probably fireproof it, but that's the sort of grazing pressure that resulted in shifting the species composition in the first place. And so somewhere in the middle is a happy medium. Grazing well probably has a more positive than neutral effect. So we can probably do better than do no harm, but if we graze in a way that is not sustainable, we can certainly do plenty of harm. And we want to identify what some of those factors are. You know, if we're trying to limit fire risk, does this mean that we're trying to prevent all fire, burn fewer acres, have fires that don't burn as hot so we have lower plant mortality? Are we trying to prevent ground fires from becoming crown fires in either shrubs or trees? You know, what are these goals? In general, it's easy to say we want healthy plant communities. You know, what is a healthy plant community? There was a publication by the National Research Council in 1994 with the title Rangeland Health, and they identified these three general categories of plant community attributes as being key to rangeland health. Soil stability, you know, was a first order concern. We saw the effects of losing soil stability in the Dust Bowl, and for the most part, perennial grass plants are all over the world the skin of the earth. They're the things that keep the dirt from leaving. And so, you know, this is a primary concern. If we're losing soil through wind or water erosion on a naturally occurring plant community that's being managed by people, then we're probably doing something wrong. There's some exceptions to that, you know, with really dry, desert, sandy rangelands that are prone to move. But for most of the inland Northwest, they should be stabilized by a diverse population of perennial plants. We're also concerned about hydrologic function. A guy who worked for the BLM for many years said we need to capture and store and safely release every single drop of water that lands on plant communities that are limited by water availability. That should be a strong second concern in defining rangeland health and thinking about how we manage them. And then finally, to do that, we need some biotic integrity, meaning we want the preferred plants to be able to reproduce themselves and be stable over time and be diverse enough that we have enough heterogeneity to deal with the various kinds of disturbances that can show up, because grazing is not the only one and may not even be the main one. So it begs the question, what are the effects of grazing? If we think through the direct effects of a grazing animal of any kind, whether it's domestic or not, on the plant community, what exactly is happening? Well, one, we're removing some of the herbaceous matter, and livestock such as cattle and sheep and some of the larger ungulates like elk are mostly removing grasses and forbs, although there's some browsing that occurs, but not much on sagebrush. So grazing is manipulating both the fine fuel amounts as well as the continuity of the fine fuel and fuel moisture levels. And then, of course, there's some, even with what I would consider to be light grazing or light stalking rates, we still have some significant, there's some interesting spatial considerations with the distribution of grazing impact. For example, if you have 100 cows on 100,000 acres, which is not much, they're gonna find a patch and graze that patch, and then they're gonna walk 50 paces, whatever it is, and graze another patch. So you have these grazed patches. And as you increase the stalking rate or the stalk density, the density of those patches increases. And it's not until the density of the patches has gotten relatively close that you begin to have then further grazing into the plant canopy. So the animals are going to take the first bite, where they're pulling off the most preferred, the highest quality forage on the top. But those effects taken together have the effect of affecting the rate of fire spread. They affect flame height, which is a significant economic consideration. Under federal regulations, as long as the fire is less than 1.5 meters, they can fight it with a ground crew. And if it's higher than that, then it requires some more expensive assets to deal with it. And it also affects the extent of fire. We could say that our goal would be, if we get a wildfire, for it to burn 500 acres or 5,000 acres instead of 5 counties all at the same time. I mentioned already that if we graze too hard, we can suppress seed production on the most preferred plants and eventually shift it over into something that is more fire prone. So this is the nuance that is pretty important to keep in mind in what are sometimes controversial discussions about the role of domestic livestock grazing on rangelands. Namely, that if we do it well, and of course the million-dollar question is, what does it look like to do it well? It can have benefits and can reduce fire risk and help avoid what happened last year, where we had approximately half of the sage-grouse habitat in the state that went up in smoke during a time of year when it burned hot and likely did a fair bit of damage. This is just a landscape that's been dominated by ventonata, which is the invasive that tends to occur in the slightly higher precipitation zones, like the transition to ponderosa pine, where there's maybe 12 to 18 inches of precip instead of true desert, like 8 to 12. All right, I think we covered all of that. So there's a couple different, we could probably stratify grazing approaches into a couple different layers. One of them is if we have a landscape, a plant community that's still dominated by the preferred perennial plants, then our main concern is how do we make sure that we maintain those preferred perennial plants and don't cause it to shift to something that it's not cost effective to rehabilitate and that creates this downward snowball that we can't deal with. The other situation is if we have invasive annual grasses present, then how can we think through grazing management as one of the only cost-effective biological controls available? How do we think through grazing in a way that suppresses the invasive annual grasses, changes the biology, the ecology of the invasive annual grasses, so that we can allow whatever perennials are there, or the ones that we might have seeded, to take over? I mentioned earlier that one of those that has been tried quite a bit is spring grazing on cheatgrass. As an annual that's dependent on seed production for reproduction, it is effective to consume all of this year's seeds. The problem is that the kind of grazing that it takes to get to all of the plants in this year really is not feasible on any kind of large acreage. We can do that maybe on an individual pasture, but the first rule of grazing management is that the cows have to be somewhere all the time, and if they're here, it means they're not there. So if they're here grazing cheatgrass when it's palatable this year, it means they're not over there, and the cheatgrass is all going to seed. Which is why some of these folks from a little bit further south, like Dr. Perryman, are saying winter grazing may be the key to slowing down cheatgrass. One, the perennial grasses are dormant, and so most of the grazing that would occur on them is not causing much damage. As long as we've got about 3 to 4 inches of residual height on the previous year's stems, that's sufficient for the plants to mobilize new growth the following spring. But the advantage of winter grazing on these annual grasses is that oftentimes those seedlings are coming up underneath the thatch, and they have some thermal protection, and they're still growing later in the fall and early winter when the other plants are not. And so those long etiolated seedlings are sort of like bean sprouts, and they have significant forage value, and they're highly palatable, and they have a lot of protein. And so animals will paw through the thatch layer to get to those bean sprouts that are coming up, and in the process, they're also willing to consume a fair bit of the thatch, which has now been softened up by fall moisture, and that has enough nutrient content as long as the animals have a sufficient protein source to feed the rumen microbes that they can actually digest that stuff that might be 2% crude protein, and a cow needs about 7%. So what are some, that's a lot about what we shouldn't do. What should we do? Well, here's a collection of some grazing guidelines for what I'm calling perennial grass rangeland. Again, Kurt Davies, who's with the Burns Oregon Research Station, has said that light to moderate stalking rates are compatible if you're grazing burn sagebrush rangelands, meaning that will promote the vigor and reproduction of the perennial plants. And of course, that begs the question, what exactly is light to moderate stalking? There's a couple ways to define that. One of them would be to say that it's generally accepted that light stalking would be that animals are removing approximately 25% of the year's biomass production. So if we were calculating a stalking rate and a particular piece of ground grows 1,000 pounds of forage per year, we would put animals on it that are at numbers that are designed to only remove 250 pounds per acre per year. That leaves approximately 75% of the plant community that's still there, both in biomass and potential reproduction, to stabilize the site. Floyd Reed was a range comm with the Forest Service for about 3 decades, and his favorite line is, you've got to graze the most preferred plants moderately, and you don't want to be in the same place at the same time every year. Meaning, because most of these plants, again, have about a 90 to 120 day window when soil conditions are conducive to plant growth, and they've got that window to produce seed and potentially reproduce themselves. So there was a paper in 2012 by Ken Sanders and Wayne Burkhart. Wayne is one of the oldest living rangeland scientists, and they did a literature review of the last 100 years of research on the perennial bunch grasses native to the Intermountain West. And they concluded from 100 years of research that probably the main thing we can say for certain is that those plants need to produce seed periodically. Whatever it takes to get there, grazing rotations, stalking rates, do whatever you want. But some years, those plants have to not get grazed during enough of May and June that they'll produce a seed head. So academically, there's a lot of talk about high density, short duration grazing, and I think that that's not incompatible with talk about stalking rates, but they're different things. When we talk about a stalking rate, this is how many animals a given piece of land can support over the course of a year, period. So if you have 100 acres of ground, it won't support 10,000 animals. It doesn't matter how aggressive your management is, how much you fertilize, what plant species you plant. There are limits. On a given piece of ground, there are limits to how many animals it can support. And so the stalking rate still matters. Where grazing rotation comes in is trying to manage the period of time that the plants are not being grazed in a way that allows them to reproduce, maintain vigor, and keep up their growth rates. So, these heavier stalking densities are not the same thing as a heavy stalking rate. A heavy stalking rate would be having 1,000 cows on 100 acres. A heavy stock density means if we have a piece of rangeland at 10,000 acres, maybe we only have 250 cows, but those 250 cows are being kept in a relatively small area and then moved so that they're not regrazing the stuff that they already got once. And if that's no clearer than mud, we can talk about it some more later. We'll see if I can finish here. The other thing is that grazing during the dormant season can be beneficial. The other rule of thumb that I think has caused a fair bit of damage is that in general, it's a good animal husbandry principle to match up the animal's nutrient demand with the forage supply, the nutrients supplied by forage. And of course, we have maximum forage nutrient value right in the middle of the growing season when you have green, actively growing plants. That's when you have this balance of crude protein and energy that is high. And of course, animals that gave birth in late winter or early spring and are then lactating that's the period of time when those animals have the highest nutrient demand, because the females are both lactating and also trying to build back body condition in preparation for breeding for the next year. And so it has been common to graze pretty hard during the springtime when the animals have their highest nutrient needs. Yeah, just to reiterate, if there's only one takeaway from this, it's that if perennial bunch grasses get grazed every single year in April and May and June, it will kill them, and they will be replaced by something else that is usually less desirable and less productive. So this is the financial aspect of it that I have spent most of the last 20 years communicating to livestock producers. When you convert a plant community through overgrazing to something less desirable, it's not just that it doesn't have pretty wildflowers on it, it's that it's usually less productive, and it's productive for a much smaller portion of the year, and the plants that live there now don't have any forage value in the wintertime. One of the reasons why they brought cows to the West is that it was discovered that these native plants were said to cure well, meaning when they went dormant, they retained their forage value, sort of like standing hay, where a lot of the introduced plants and much of these invasive annuals have almost no forage value once they've gone dormant. And so cows could be let go for the winter, and in the springtime, they would still be in excellent condition because the native plants had significant forage value. So there are very direct economic incentives to protect the productive potential of the plant community through maintaining a desirable species composition. I think we've talked through most of this. I'm going to see if I can get through this. As I've said, what I would call light to moderate grazing is going to disrupt the continuity of the fine fuels, which significantly limits fire behavior. In fact, in Washington State, when there are big fires, it's common for the fire agency to call up whoever the local landowners are, including agency landowners, and find out where's the edge of the nearest grazing allotment. And they will typically start there and working back toward the fire and making a defense against a fast-moving fire. Because this light grazing that looks a bit like that, where there's still plenty of plant material left, is significantly resistant to catastrophic fire, both in terms of flame height, continuity of fire, and the aerial extent of fire. We want to try to reduce the amount of seeds that are produced by invasive annual grasses if that's possible. This is just some comic relief. I've had a grazing project on that wind farm east of Ellensburg, owned by Puget Sound Energy, for about 12 years, and I spent a fair bit of time out there. And this year, for the first time, I saw a couple bears. So I was out there actually with a group of students from Evergreen, and we're doing kind of a 3-day range short course. And we're standing here on a hillside, just talking and watching the world go by, and somebody says, "I think that's a bear down there." So we looked down, and sure enough, there were 2 bears, a little cinnamon-colored bear and a black one. They looked like they were probably 2-year-olds because they were too big to be this year's cubs, and they for sure weren't adult size. So we stood and watched them for probably a half hour. And at some point, we had to move. And once we moved, the cinnamon-colored bear started running across the hillside. And he was running, he's not but 100 yards below that group of cows. And the cows never looked up. They had no concern whatsoever for that bear. They evidently have been sharing the space for some time, and they know each other quite well. I actually ended up seeing the bear about a week later. I was doing some monitoring on a transect, and I was squatting down, filling out something on a field form, and when I stood up and turned around, this bear was about 30 yards away. It was not from here to the back of the room. He was standing straight up, just looking at me. And as soon as I stood up and looked at him, he kind of turned to go back down. So this was the shot that I caught as he was turning to go back down. And once he got down, I couldn't see him or hear him for the rest of the day. I was there for probably another 3 hours, and I have no idea where he was. He started awfully close, and I couldn't see bushes moving. I didn't see him moving, never heard anything. I was quite impressed by the ability of the bear to evade detection. All right, last couple things. There's a group of us with WSU that got a grant from the Climate Hub to do some short film documentaries a couple years ago on what we called resilience against climate uncertainty on rangelands. And the thrust of this was that most of the things that we would do to manage rangelands in a way that would make them more resilient against the kinds of vegetation change that could occur in response to global warming and climate change are the things that we should be doing anyway. And so we called these no-regret strategies that it doesn't matter what you think about climate change, it's a good idea, both ecologically and economically, and I would say socially. So we picked ranches in Idaho, Oregon, and Washington that were managing different aspects of resiliency. The Stingleys are a ranching family around Ellensburg that graze on this wind farm I was talking about. And that one we focused on ecological resiliency, managing for a maximally diverse native plant community and the effects that has on animal health. The one in the Richards are a family in Idaho in the Owyhees who pioneered some of these fire cooperative associations where you have local landowners getting trained with fire agencies so that they can cooperate in the event of a fire. And they've also done some innovative grazing in post-burn landscapes in a way that is improving the plant community. And then Jack Southworth is a rancher in Oregon who is very operationally resilient. In other words, he's in a location where there can be quite a bit of variation from year to year in forage production, and so he manages that by being really flexible in the number of animals that he puts out. So some years he may not put very many out at all, and in years when there's lots of grass, he contracts extra livestock to be able to take economic advantage of that, instead of having a fixed cow herd that may do damage on years of low forage production and be understocked in years when there's lots of forage production. And lastly, I've been doing a podcast called The Art of Range since October of 2018, interviewing people from all over the West, all over the world, who are experts in rangelands and rangelands grazing, including livestock producers that I consider to be experts on rangeland grazing. So that's been a really fun project, and there's quite a bit of stuff on there on fire, invasive species management, targeted grazing, and I think just if you take a look, you can scan it and see what you like. It is available on any of the major podcasting apps. So if you search for it in iTunes or Stitcher or whatever you're using, you should be able to find it. Or you can go to artofrange.com and listen directly on the website. I think that's all. We may be out of time, but I'm happy to just visit for a minute. Yeah.
So you had said that after a fire, light grazing is recommended, correct?
Yeah,
So at NRCS, after a wildfire, we generally do like a rest defer.
yeah.
So like we rest for an entire year and then the following year we graze only after the critical period for
Right.
scrapping. Do you know if like grazing and
Yeah.
and a rest defer after wildfire?
Yeah, I think that's still a good practice with a couple caveats. You know, one, all fires are not created equal, and so there can be pretty dramatic differences in the effects of fire. And in particular, if a fire is moving pretty fast through, you know, a plant community that looks like this. See if it'll go up again. If a fire moves quickly through that, it's probably not going to kill many of the grasses, and there may not be a lot of benefit in not grazing them the next year. I think there's still, in most scenarios, a lot of benefit in not grazing until after seed set the first year, mostly because these plants produce seed every year, but they don't produce viable seed every year. There can be pretty there's a lot of variability from year to year in the viability of what seed gets produced. Sometimes you have empty florets, and there's often a nutrient flush following fire that results in a significantly higher percentage of viable seed in the year or two after fire. So that's one of the reasons for that, you know, that general recommendation that applies also on most federal and state rangelands. Yeah, the University of Idaho has done some research on that. I think there are a couple of considerations. One is that if we're grazing lightly, in a normal year, there's a ton of seed heads that don't ever get grazed at all. And so, like on this wind farm I'm talking about, you know, where we're applying approximately a 25% harvest coefficient every single year on every single pasture, the majority of seed heads don't get grazed because the animal will go up to an individual plant and they'll graze off part of the plant, and many of the stems, the seed culms, won't be grazed at all. And so with light stalking, you know, it's probably not totally necessary to have a full year of rest. But in a lot of situations, I think it's really useful to at least wait until after seed shatter in the first year or two following fire, just to make sure that whatever seed is produced goes on the ground. It also has the added benefit of potentially helping to plant some of that seed. There's an interesting story from Mount St. Helens. I was there maybe in 2005, and this was a range tour, and the guy who was the geologist there that was visiting with us said that after Mount St. Helens blew, you've got 300 feet of the pulverized insides of a mountain now piled up on the ground. You know, so all the geologists and plant people are interested because what does primary succession look like? How do we get to a plant community from nothing but rock? And maybe 10 or 15 years after the mountain blew, the elk herd started moving back through that area again. And he said the elk were, you know, punching through this kind of rocky crust that was on top. And the geologists were initially upset by that. But they said pretty soon, whatever fine sediments were blowing across the landscape, they settled out in these little hoof marks. That began to catch a tiny bit of water. Then you had some seed that settled in there, and the places where plants showed up first were in these elk hoof mark, these pock marks. And it created a microclimate that supported seed production. And so you got red alder, which is a nitrogen-fixing tree that established in there. You had lupins, which are also nitrogen fixers and early colonizers that showed up inside these elk hoof marks. And that was the beginning of a plant community. Of course, once they get going, then you've got root material that begins to break down rock and produce soil, and then other stuff starts to show up. And as I mentioned before, perennial grass seed has to come in contact with bare soil to germinate. And where you have, oftentimes in a post-fire landscape, you've got a pretty crusty surface on the soil, and seed that's sitting on that often won't germinate. You know, it doesn't work its way in fast enough, and it gets picked up by other granivores in the landscape, you know, birds and rodents that are eating the seed. And so this grazing in the dormant season can also have the effect of planting some of those seeds and creating microsites in an otherwise, you know, inhospitable soil surface. Sorry, that was a long answer. Other questions? Lynn?
I'm interested in microbiome crusts, and is there a place for trying to reestablish microbiome crusts to keep that on invasives, or to rebuild right after fire?
Yeah, I know there's some research on jump-starting microbiotic crusts or cryptogams following fire. I don't know how successful it is. Yeah, I think on a lot of shallow, rocky soils, they're one of the primary things that holds the dirt together because it's not even very compatible. That microsite's not very conducive to grasses. But I don't know much about getting them going after fire.
Would they interfere just as much with perennials as animals?
Yeah, they can. Right. Yeah, and I would say too, I don't know if I have any photographs in here, but again, this light to moderate grazing tends to permit those microbiotic crusts to remain intact. Because the animals, interestingly, the cows, even more than the wild animals that are out there, tend to follow, when they're moving across the landscape, they tend to follow trails. So when they're grazing, they're out a little bit everywhere, but when they're moving, they follow trails. Whereas, you watch a herd of elk moving, it's almost like a flock of birds moving across the ground. So their behavior is quite a bit different. And in places with light stocking rates, you tend to not see a lot of disturbance of the cryptogamic crusts, except like in places around water, which are going to happen any place there's grazing animals at all. Yeah, some of the grazing crowd have nothing good to say about the microbiotic crusts, as you know. But I would say in the rangelands that I've seen that have a lot of microbiotic crusts, they're typically present in places where there's not a lot of grass, or they're present like underneath a sagebrush plant where there's otherwise just bare soil and sagebrush litter, and there's not grass there anyway. But for the most part, it seems to be compatible. I think that is the destruction of those crusts is one of the risks of dormant season grazing because they're more brittle, and you tend to get more soil disturbance from the hoof action from livestock, particularly in concentration areas like around water. Which is, again, it's another reason for this rule of not being in the same place the same time every year. If this spot only gets grazed in August 1 year out of 5, that's not going to have a negative effect on some of those more sensitive features of the plant-soil interface.
So in your observation, how is it going in kind of getting a new logical mindset into the grazing ownership?
Yeah, I'm actually pretty optimistic about that. There's an awful lot of folks who were grazing the way Grandpa did. I mean, Grandpa was grazing the way his grandpa did, and a lot of Eastern Washington that's in poor ecological condition has been that way for 100 years, and some of the newer generation that are grazing it have a different idea about how to do it, and they're applying some of these rules like we're talking about. I was on a ranch near Ritzville on just a few days ago. What is today? Saturday. I was there on Wednesday. And, it's a 10,000 acre place. His grandpa died and the dad took over, and then this guy's dad died when he was 25 years old. So he took over at 25 years old. And, he's been managing it differently. And he said he never knew anything but Medusa head as far as the eye could see. And the neighbor's place is all the same way. And he's been managing differently for about a decade. And you can see a significant difference, on a fence line between how he's managing and how the neighbors are managing. And some of the neighbors are also experiencing, there's a lot of transition going on right now, both with, people dying and businesses getting transferred. A lot of larger farms have finally caught on to succession planning and have figured out that, the 90-year-old should probably let his 70-year-old son start making some decisions before he's dead too. So there's a lot of that happening and passing that even further down the chain. So I see more young people getting into livestock production now than I did 20 years ago, and they're getting results, and that's also having positive social effects. For example, the Department of Fish and Wildlife would say if everybody was doing it the way that guy is, we wouldn't be concerned about grazing on shrub steppe wildlife habitat. And that's starting to catch. Yeah, I'm optimistic. Yeah.
I don't know if it's comment about that. A lot of the livestock producers that I work with, they are coming across fire after fire after fire. I have one producer who, in the last 10 years, has killed 5 large-scale fires on his land, and so he's really open to suggestions, and they really don't want to overgraze their land, and they really want to promote bunch grasses growth, and you can see a difference between this guy and the guy next door who's been consistently fired, that, this guy's been following a grazing plan for the last 20 years, and the guy next door, he grazes it however he wants, he overgrazes, and there's too many cattle on his land, and it's all cheap grass. It's all cheap grass and three-foot sage instead of Wyoming sage, which is certain sage grouse and piggy rats and the area. So, yeah, I think that producers are really willing to do that.
Yeah, thanks. Any other questions? I think we've got just a few more minutes. Yeah. Sounds good. We'll check out the Art of Range. Yeah, go ahead.
How, is the approach the same if you have, open range versus a solo pasture, forest or semi-forest?
Yeah, I think it depends a bit on the kind of plant community. There's I would say somewhere around 20 to 25 inches of precipitation. You go from having primarily bunch grass that have elevated growing points, jointed grasses that are more dependent on seed production, and you have a transition to more rhizomatous type grasses that are tolerant of more frequent grazing. So depending on the forest, in ponderosa pine with mostly bunch grasses underneath it, you still have to make sure you're protecting seed production. And aside from that, there's some considerations for avoiding damaging new trees, like in young forests or, seeded forests. Plant back after a timber harvest or something, because the leaders on the new trees are pretty valuable, nutritious, and there's lots of other things that eat those too. But cows certainly will. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I've had Matt Reeves, who's with the Forest Service out of Missoula, and most of his work is on that side of the Rocky Mountain crest, and also Brady Allred and Matt Jones. Brady's at Montana State, and they're the ones that created the Rangelands Analysis Platform, which is providing plant cover values and more recently net primary production through this web-based tool where you can outline an area of interest, kind of like the Web Soil Survey, and get cover values and how they've changed over time. So they've been on the podcast a few times, but I haven't done a lot on the short grass and mixed grass prairie, because you get to the other side of the Rockies and it's a little bit different plant community, and sometimes those species can often tolerate closer grazing than we would be comfortable with here. Things like blue grama, buffalo grass, they don't have nearly this much volume to begin with, and so sometimes that looks rough, even when it's not. But there's certainly plenty of places that just slick it off. Lynn.
So, you mentioned your interviews, these no regret strategies and different scenarios. And so, again, can you talk a little bit about the paradigm change and how does approaching something that like is good whether or not you believe in climate change, has it made people more open to just the fact that they are changing the whole ecology and that has made them more open to maybe accepting climate change and the feelings to it?
I think so. The one with Russ Stingley is interesting. He's nearly 70, and he's as crusty a conservative old rancher as you can imagine. And he's describing pretty significant changes in groundwater and what's coming out of the springs that they use over the last 30 years. And he's also one who would say that leaving a lot of vegetation on the ground is he would have thought that was like leaving money on the table, but he'd say it's more like leaving money in the bank because you're protecting next year's forage production. They would also say that their calves that come off of this kind of rangeland are much healthier and have significantly lower pharmaceutical costs than the ones that are grazing, a monoculture of irrigated pasture in the valley. Where any of places like this have, on a 10 by 30 meter species richness plot, there can easily be 50 or 60 plant species. And while the perennial grasses make up 90% of the animal's diet, they're consuming little bitty parts of other plants that have, micronutrients and other plant secondary compounds that have significant benefits to the animal. That are part of keeping them healthy. So the animals do well on that kind of ground. There's one of my favorite interviews is with Dr. Fred Provenza. He's a researcher from Utah State University that started the Behave Project. He was an animal behaviorist and studied diet selection in wild animals and domesticated animals both. And he was one of the ones who showed that if they introduced internal parasites into a group of sheep and put them out on rangeland, the sheep would select for plants that were high in tannins that would kill the worms. And the list goes on and on. But he's one who's talked a lot about the value of these plant secondary compounds for numerous aspects of animal health. He wrote a book called Shepherding with a guy from France where they were describing forage sequencing that was common in places like France and Spain, where you had these old sheep herders that likely didn't have any idea why what they did worked. But They knew that if they put sheep on this plant community first and then went to the blackbrush, that the animals would then be able to digest the blackbrush and metabolize some of the otherwise undigestible oils that were in the plant or whatever. And we know a bit more about some of that now, but there's some really fascinating stuff on diet selection, forage sequencing, the value of botanical diversity for animal health, and also there's an interview with a guy from Utah, Sam Fuhlendorf, who's done a lot of research on heterogeneity and the value of not trying to homogenize the plant community to make it all Western wheatgrass. He would say having 6 different patches of vegetation makes you 6 times less likely to be entirely wrong. Meaning, having most Western landscapes are variable, not just vast, where you can have a totally different plant community right here than you do 10 steps that way. And trying to make them all the same thing by planting or using herbicide is probably a bad idea, ecologically, economically, and in terms of animal health. Yeah. Fred Provenza, Provenza. And I think shepherding is the title of the book. Okay, thank you. I'll stick around if anybody wants to come visit.